Okay, hi everybody, and thanks for having me here. Um, so I'm gonna try to not say anything controversial, which is kind of sad because it's a philosophy uh, talk, and usually I expect philosophy people to say controversial things. I might mention some controversial things, but I won't defend any here. So what I want to do is I just want to. So I'm expecting this is a kind of a broad audience, and so I wanted to start this workshop by giving a kind of an overview of epistemology and some epistemological issues connected to AR for folks who don't spend a lot of time thinking about epistemology. And I'm going to do this with a bunch of contrasts. So the first kind of question that we might be asking is, what do we care about when we care about the epistemology of AR? So epistemology, if you don't know, is the theory of knowledge, but a whole lot of what epistemologists are interested in is not knowledge, but other things that are kind of connected to knowledge. And the big one is justification. So justification is a kind of a technical term. To say that a belief is justified is to say that it's reasonable or rational, or in some kind of similar way, it's the right thing for you to believe, even if that belief is false. All right, so knowledge can't be false, right? If you know that P, then P is true, but you can have justified belief even if in P, even if P is false. So knowledge is not a technical term. I think in a lot of ways, knowledge is, there are people who, as some of you will know, there are the knowledge first epistemologists, and some knowledge first epistemologists are also knowledge last epistemologists. They think we shouldn't even worry about justification. All we should ever talk about or care about is knowledge. And I think part of what motivates that idea is that knowledge is this kind of pre-theoretical concept that everybody has. So I don't propose to tell you what knowledge is, but to kind of fit it into epistemology, a kind of a standard view is that knowledge is justified true belief that is furthermore un-Gettiered. Now, of course, a lot of you will know what Gettier, who Gettier was. Some of you won't. So Gettier has these famous cases to show that knowledge is not mere justified true belief. Some kind of classic Gettier cases, what a Gettier case is a case of justified true belief that isn't knowledge. And so I'll just talk about just a couple, because I could go on all day about this stuff. So this one's actually, this one predates Gettier by quite a bit, because it's due to Bertrand Russell. He says, imagine I look at a clock that I have every reason to think is accurate and reliable, and the clock says 3 o'clock. So I form the belief that it's 3 o'clock. Unbeknownst to me, that clock stopped precisely 12 hours ago. So I have a justified belief, right? I have reason to trust the clock. The clock tells me that it's 3 o'clock. I believe that it's 3 o'clock. It turns out, coincidentally, that it is 3 o'clock, but because it's a coincidence, we're not inclined to call that a case of knowledge. And so that's a kind of what we would call a Gettiered belief. It's a justified true belief that isn't knowledge. Another kind of famous example, this one is it's slightly controversial in the sense that some people have endorsed theories of knowledge that require them to deny that this is a case of knowledge, but most of us intuitively think that it's a case of knowledge, is the case of barn facades. So the idea is this. Henry is driving through the countryside in an environment where there happen to be a whole lot of things on the side of the road that look like barns but are not. In fact, they're papier-mâché barn facades. Henry looks at one of these things, looks at something and forms the belief that it's a barn. This one happens to actually be a barn, even though most of the things around him that look like barns are not barns. So most of us have the intuition that Henry, in this case, has a Gettiard belief. That is, he has a belief that is justified because it looks like a barn. He has no reason to think that things around here aren't barns. It's a justified belief. It's true because it really is a barn, but it's not a case of knowledge. And it's not a case of knowledge because there are so many things around that look like barns but aren't. So I think that kind of Gettiard case is especially going to be interesting in the context of augmented reality, especially if you think that augmented reality images are misleading, right? So, okay, the next contrast is different theories of justification. Epistemologists are, if they're not undecided, I don't know if anybody's undecided, but are internalist or externalists. So these are just defined in one of them is defined as the complement of the other. So internalism is the view that justification supervenes on factors that are internal to the agent. So there are a couple of different ways of trying to unpack internal. One is to say that it's that the justification supervenes on the agent's non-factive mental states. Another is to say that it supervenes on facts that are reflectively accessible to the agent. And then we'll just define externalism as the denial of internalism, right? So that is, it's partly determined by external factors, that is, the factors that don't make the internalists lists. And so to actually put some flesh on that, these will be things like environmental factors or historical factors. So you might think that reliability is important to justification. If you do, depending on exactly how you work that out, then you're not going to be an internalist, right? So if take a very simple kind of reliabilism, a belief is justified just in case it's reliably produced. So me here using this particular process or method might be reliable. You put me in some other environment, that process is not reliable. An externalist of this particular sort would say that I'm justified in the first case and I'm not justified in the second case. Another case is evolutionary history, right? So a different kind of externalism is one that takes evolutionary history seriously. So you might think that you could have two molecule for molecule identical agents. They have all the same non-factive mental states. That doesn't follow from them being molecularly identical, but we could just stipulate that they are. They have all of the same reflectively accessible facts. But because one of them has a particular evolutionary history and the other one has a different one or doesn't have any history at all, maybe it's Swamp Man just came into existence a minute ago, they may have different epistemic statuses on the basis of their evolutionary history. And if you say that, then you're an externalist. So the next contrast is between two different things that we might be assessing epistemically, belief or ignorance. So typically what we're interested in as epistemologists is and has been belief, right? So we're interested in states of the agent, or we're interested in propositions that the agent might stand in a particular doxastic attitude toward. There's an important contrast in epistemology between what we call doxastic justification and propositional justification. So when we talk about doxastic justification, we're talking about the epistemic status, the justificatory status of a belief that the agent actually has. And we're asking whether that belief is proper for the agent. And again, it's a kind of propriety that includes the possibility that it's false, right? So, I mean, I might have very good evidence for thinking that there's money in my bank account, but unbeknownst to me, somebody has, drained it. So I could have a belief that's justified but false, and it's justified, doxastically justified, in case, typically people will say, in case it was arrived at in the proper way, right? It was formed properly. But then it's also important sometimes to talk about propositional justification, which is the justification that I might have for a merely potential belief, or I might have potentially for a belief that I actually hold. So to say that a belief is propositionally justified, or to say that a proposition better is propositionally justified for an agent, is to say that that's the thing that the agent should believe, presumably on the basis of the agent's evidence or whatever. And so I can have that kind of justification even if I don't believe it. I could also have a good justification for believing something and thus be propositionally justified, even though I'm not doxastically justified because I believe it for a bad reason. So I have great evidence for P, but the only reason I believe P is that the tarot cards told me P. Another thing, and I didn't think this, here's a two-way split that I thought didn't justify its own slide. It's important to keep in mind a distinction between prima facie and ultima facie justification. So you're prima facie justified just in case you have some positive reason to believe something. And then we can have prima facie propositional justification, prima facie doxastic justification. The ultima facie justification is when you have prima facie justification and don't have defeaters. So defeaters are considerations that kill or undercut or undermine or weaken prima facie justification. So a kind of classic example is I walk into a room and there's a red widget on the table, or what looks to be a red widget on the table. That gives me reason to think that there's something red in front of me. And then a trustworthy, reliable source tells me that that object is being bathed in red light. That's a defeater. So I have prima facie justification. Vision gives me prima facie justification. So vision gives me reason to believe this thing, yet I know on some other grounds that I'm in circumstances where things are not normally going to be as they appear, at least with respect to their colors. That gives me a reason to retract that, and so that undermines my justification. So I'll have a belief that's prima facie justified, but not ultima facie justified. That is not just justified outright. Okay, so that's belief, and that's what epistemologists have concerned themselves with mostly. People have just in recent years started looking at ignorance and when is ignorance, epistemically proper? So ignorance can be unpacked in different ways, and people will unpack it in different ways. Ignorance can be understood as the lack of belief. It can be understood as the lack of justification, or it can be understood as the lack of knowledge. So obviously, AR environments are going to be environments where, assuming that you know you're in an AR environment, you're going to know that there are certain respects in which things are not as they seem, and so you're going to have defeaters. I tend to often think of AR environments as environments where things are added to the real environment, but there are also AR environments where things are deleted from them. So I'm thinking of certain kind of Black Mirror episodes where the girl doesn't get to see the barking dog because it's scary, or when the protagonist doesn't get to see his ex-wife or whoever she is because she blocked him and now he's unable to see her. So there will be AR-induced ignorance, and ignorance, like belief, is epistemically accessible. It's going to be epistemically accessible in a different kind of way. And I'm not sure that the doxastic propositional justification distinction, the prima facie, ultima facie distinction, apply to ignorance, or if they do, that they apply to ignorance in the way that they apply to belief. But they're both worth looking into, even though epistemologists have traditionally focused on belief. Okay, next contrast. I want to look at different sources of knowledge and justification. So there's a lot of epistemology of source work in epistemology. So, you know, some people write a lot about the epistemology of intuition, or the epistemology of a priori reasoning, or the epistemology of memory. But I think kind of the most developed areas of source epistemology in the field are the epistemology of perception and the epistemology of testimony. And these two, it happens, are pretty centrally involved in AR. So one kind of augmentation that AR provides, of course, is by adding or deleting perceptual objects, right? So you can make a little elephant appear in somebody's hands, or deleting perceptual objects, right? Making it so that the person can't see his XY space. Or you can change their properties, right? You can have an AR system where things systematically appear to have different properties in various ways. So that's obviously relevant to perception. But there's a different kind of augmentation that I think a lot of people are interested in, which is augmentation by labeling, right? So you add names or descriptors or information to things, right? So someday I'll be able to to have an AR program that'll tell me what kind of tree I'm looking at, and it'll just type out Eastern red cedar, for instance, when I look at the tree. So I take that to be a matter of testimony rather than perception. I mean, obviously, there's perception involved in testimony. There's always perception involved in testimony. You have to see the thing to read it, or you have to hear it if somebody's speaking to you. But the epistemology of perception and the epistemology of testimony are distinct. There are a lot of interesting relations and interactions between them. There's a big debate, there's a big debate about how similar testimony is to perception. So we tend to think that perception is a basic source of justification. Not everybody thinks that. And that'll lead to, I'll come back to that in a little bit, but a lot of people think that perception is a basic source of justification in the sense that the justification that accrues to perception is not derivable from the justification that accrues to other sources. So I think Descartes, Fiona mentioned Descartes didn't think that, right? So Descartes thought that the justification that accrues to perception is reducible to the justification that accrues to introspection and to demonstrative reasoning, or at least, I mean, that's the view that you get. That's the kind of standard way that I think we teach the Descartes of the meditations, right? So I have this introspective belief that I'm having a certain kind of sensory experience. I have this deductive argument for thinking that God wouldn't let me have this kind of sensory experience unless there was a chair over there, therefore there must be a chair over there. So on that view, perception is reducible to introspection and deduction, but nobody believes that. They all, pretty much everybody thinks that, no, you have to have some special principles about perception, right? It's not just everything, it's not just anything else that we already had. So the standard view then is that perceptual justification is fundamental in the sense that in the sense I just described, right? It's not reducible to anything else. Testimony, on the other hand, it's much more controversial whether testimony is a basic source of justification in the way that I just described or not. Some people think that it is. They think that just like perception, right, there's no way to get a non-skeptical view about the epistemology of testimony without having special principles governing testimony. You're not going to get it just out of language comprehension, induction, abduction, and the rest. Okay, next contrast. How basic or inferential is the justification? This is very closely related to the last one, but I think not exactly the same thing. So the two views that you might take here are what I'm calling dogmatism and inferentialism, and I don't like either term, partly because they mean too many different things to too many different people. The dogmatism and inferentialism distinction will apply to both perception and testimony. So according to dogmatism, the fact that you see that P, or that you seem to see that P, I'll come back to that difference in a bit, suffices for prima facie justification for believing that P, right? So if it seems to me that there's a chair, if it perceptually seems to me that there's a chair there, then I'm prima facie justified in believing that there's a chair there. Again, it's prima facie, it's defeasible justification, right? I mean, I may have reason for thinking that I'm hallucinating right now. I may have reason for thinking that that I'm in an unreliable environment, and so on. Inferentialism says that even that prima facie justification requires positive reason to think that perception, to take the perceptual case, is reliable. Or, as you will often, probably more often these days see it, to think that P is the best explanation of the experience. So I take it that if P, that in order to be justified in thinking that P is the best explanation of the experience, I have to think that perception is reliable, right? I mean, otherwise, their being there wouldn't be a very good explanation. But I mean, I think that I'm not prepared to die on that hill today. But the important thing is that the inferentialist thinks it's not just a matter of answering defeaters, right? That in order to have even just the first bit of positive justification for thinking that there's a chair over there, I need to already have some kind of reason to think the perception is reliable. So the dogmatists think, no, I don't have to do that, right? Merely seeming to see the chair is enough for me to have prima facie justification. And then I also have to not have defeaters in order to have justification outright. That is, to have ultimate facie justification. So both agree that I need to not believe that perception is unreliable in these circumstances. But they're gonna, that need is gonna solve different problems for the different theories, right? So for dogmatism, it's a matter of of not having defeaters. For inferentialism, it's needed in order to get prima facie justification off the ground. Okay, so then another contrast is between the disjunctivist and the traditional views. So the traditional view is that factivity only matters for knowledge, not for justification. So I said a minute ago, the fact that S sees or seems to see that P is prima facie justification. The traditional view will take the seems to route, right? So whether I see a chair, whether I seem to see a chair doesn't make any difference. I mean, it does, like, for knowledge, right? So if I merely seem to see a chair, then I don't know, right? If I'm not actually seeing a chair, but I seem to see a chair, then I don't know that there's a chair over there, even if it turns out that there really is one, right? I mean, I think I think we would all take that to be a Gettier case. So factivity matters for knowledge on anybody's view. The traditional view says it doesn't matter for justification. On an epistemological disjunctivist view, it does, right? So if I'm actually seeing a cup or a chair or whatever, then I'm more justified in believing that there's a cup or a chair than if I only seem to see one. So two ways the disjunctivists could go here. They could say that in the non-factive, the non-veridical case, I have justification, but I don't have full justification. Or they could say I have a kind of justification, but I don't have the good kind, the best kind of justification. So that's Schellenberg's view. Other disjunctivists would say, no, I just don't have any. So I think that's Alex Burns' view, right? I don't have any justification in that case. If I'm merely seeming to see a chair and not actually seeing one. Okay, one last contrast, and I reverse the colors because this isn't an epistemological contrast, but it's a contrast that'll be relevant for the things that we're interested in, I think. And that's a contrast between realistic augmentation and obvious augmentation. So the difference here is just whether or not you can tell perceptually that some feature is an augmentation or not. So whether it's contributed by the world or contributed by the AR system. So I take it that some of the augmentations are going to be really obvious, right? I mean, so if it's cartoonish, if it's text, right? So the thing that says Eastern Red Cedar, it's obvious to me that's an augmentation, that's part of the AR setup and not part of the physical environment outside of me. I think that there will be different grades or degrees, but I actually think probably grades, depending on whether we're counting background knowledge here. So, so when I see text, it's obvious. It's just kind of, or I see a cartoon, something it's kind of perceptually obvious without having to import much any substantive background knowledge. But then there are other cases where you might see very realistic fish floating around the air in front of you. But that's obviously implausible, and so it's obvious to anyone, right? I mean, so in some sense, it perceptually looks like fish, but it's not realistic in the sense of likely to fool anybody. You might be in an AR environment where inductive generalization about this particular system allows you to reject things just as if it were flying fish. So it might be that yeah, what I'm seeing is just a cat as I walk down the street, and there's nothing implausible about cats, but I just happen to know that that the system that I'm using populates my environment with cats like crazy, and then so I would not be inclined to believe that this one's an actual cat. Okay, so that's all I have for contrast. Now I just want to kind of raise some questions for discussion that come out of this, and hopefully I'm going to be able to do this without having to change my screen because I've got the participants blocking part of my screen. So the big question in epistemology is, what should we believe? And I think the big question in the epistemology of AR is, what should an AR user believe? So I want to start by supposing that the augmentation is obvious, right? I mean, in whatever sense, I just said there are different senses, but in whatever sense, let's suppose that the augmentation is obvious. So I think in these cases, nearly everybody will say that it doesn't produce perceptual justification. Right? That is, if if you've got little cartoon, very obviously cartoonish, or very obviously implausible objects, or things that you have very good reason to think that the system populates the world with, everybody will say that it doesn't produce, I think, perceptual justification, or at least that it doesn't produce ultima facie perceptual justification. But it might still produce testimonial justification. So I could imagine someday having an AR system that helps me go out in the woods and find mushrooms. Right, so I'm out there looking for morels, and it's better at spotting them than I am, and so it populates the forest with little cartoon mushrooms. So that strikes me as a kind of telling, as a kind of testimonial, indicating that there are mushrooms nearby. Suppose the augmentation is realistic, so the kind of thing that could fool somebody. So internalists will say that whether there's any reduction in justification depends on, I'm sorry, I gotta do this for a second. Whether there's any, whether there's a reduction in justification depends on a subject's knowledge or justified belief about the prevalence of realistic augmentation, right? So that is, if you know you're in an AR situation, then you're going to have defeaters, and you'll have lots of reason to think this. I mean, I think it's so Fiona mentioned Descartes' famous case, and central to that was that you don't know. Right, you don't know that you're being deceived by a demon. If you didn't know that you were in an AR environment, then the internalist would say that there's no reduction in your justification. You're just as justified in that, right? I mean, you're prima facie justified. So if you see fish floating around, well, okay, you might have good defeaters for that. But if you see a cat and you don't know anything, right? I mean, you don't know that you're in an AR environment, then you're perfectly justified in thinking that. Furthermore, contrary to the disjunctivists, the internalist will say that there's no difference between real and ersatz perception, right? So if I'm having an experience as of a chair, it doesn't matter whether that's the real world shining through the apparatus or whether that's an augmentation. The justification story is the same in both cases. Then there's a debate about why A is true. That is, there's a debate about whether that knowledge affects your prima facie justification or whether it only concerns defeat. And that's because, right, an internalist can either be of an inferentialist or a dogmatist sort. Externalists will have different options. So some externalists, so reliabilists, for example, will say that whether there's any reduction in justification depends on actual prevalence of realistic augmentation, whether you know it or not. So if a whole lot of the things that you're seeing in the environment are augmentations rather than real, and then that means that in this environment, your perceptual capacities are unreliable. I realize that requires a certain understanding of the metaphysics here. But if it's unreliable, then even if you don't know, then you're unjustified. Other externalists will say that it only depends on the subject's knowledge or justified beliefs. So proper functionalists, for instance, and certain kinds of reliabilists go to kind of great lengths to say that even if we were in Descartes' demon scenario, we're still justified, because justification isn't a matter of reliability where you are, it's a matter of reliability in the world that you evolved in. And since the capacities that you're exercising are reliable in the world that you evolved in, for instance, you're still justified. Even if the current environment is one very highly unreliable. Disjunctivists will say that there's a big difference between the case of real and ersatz perception, even for justification. So on all the views, the subject's knowledge that there are lots of augmentations. So if you know that you're in an AR environment, gives you a defeater for your perceptual beliefs. And then there's a kind of a debate about whether this is a matter of defeat or a matter of prima facie justification, depending on whether you're an inferentialist or a dogmatist. Okay, so suppose the augmentation is obvious. It can still generate testimonial justification, even if the conditions for testimony, it can still generate testimonial justification provided that the conditions for testimonial justification are met. And so I want to just kind of close by saying that AR offers, when I started thinking about this, I was thinking, oh, there's going to be a lot of interesting things about the philosophy, about the epistemology of perception that come out of this. But I think maybe the more interesting things are in the epistemology of testimony. So AR is a kind of an interesting source of testimony. In an AR environment, I take it that a lot of the AR environment is going to be informing one about things. It's going to be the labeling use of augmentation. The agent in the system doesn't know who's testifying. And we're familiar with this. This happens on the internet all the time. It happens in The Economist. They don't use bylines. But in the case of like regular old face-to-face testimony, right, you know who's telling you. It might be a stranger, right? You don't know their name, but like you know who it is who's telling you. So that's a difference. Using that Morell's case that I suggested earlier, it can use non-linguistic conventions in addition to the regular linguistic conventions that we normally are interested in when we talk about the epistemology of testimony. Oftentimes the agent might have to learn that it's testimony, which is something that we don't in the regular testimony case, or if we did have to learn it, we learned it before we were forming long-term memories. Right, we learned it as infants if we ever did learn it. It's not very plausibly innate, and so it blocks a certain kind of defense of testimonial trust, right? So there's this, Thomas Reid has this kind of influential view that like we are designed to trust people, and that's why it's epistemically okay to trust people. That kind of argument isn't going to transfer as well to the AR case. There are also people in the epistemology of testimony who try to get a mileage out of the fact that testimony is essentially social, right? It's people with other people. Right, it's a community of conspecifics, and that's really not necessary, I think, with AR. So it doesn't have to be essentially social. So here's a kind of a question that I want to leave with among the other things that have come up, and it's a question, and I guess I just really don't know what to think about it. Is inferentialism more plausible for AR testimony than it is for standard testimony? I mean, so that is, like, a lot of people think that the mere fact that someone seems to say that P gives you enough of a prima facie reason to believe that P, without you having to have without you also having to think that people are generally reliable or any of that kind of stuff. That view is perhaps less plausible for AR testimony than it is for standard testimony. If that's right, then I think there are two ways we might proceed. Right? You could use that fact to undermine a kind of an automaticity argument for dogmatism about testimony. One of the reasons people endorse that dogmatist view about testimony I just mentioned, as long as somebody says a P, you're prima facie justified in believing P, is because we don't seem to be engaging in any inference. We just go from the one to the other immediately. Surely we'll do the same thing in an AR environment. Once we get used to it. That's how overlearning works. It automatizes things. Another way, in the opposite direction, is we could use the contrast between AR and standard testimony to strengthen that case for dogmatism about the standard testimony, right? So you could say, oh yeah, but look how, so yes, dogmatism is more plausible for standard testimony than it is for AR testimony. One way of reading that is to say, oh, well, so we should say the same thing about both. So we should deny that that dogmatism is true about standard testimony. Another is to say, no, but look how different they are. So the contrast is just more proof of how dogmatic we should be about standard testimony. All right, that's all I have time for. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Jack. Brilliant. Thank you. That was fantastic. So why don't we try just people using the sort of put your hand up reaction if you would like to ask Jack a question. If you go into reactions, you should see raise a hand.
I'll note that I was not able to read the chat, especially big long things in the chat or follow links while I was talking. Yeah, I mean, if you want to ask me about that, I'll happily try to talk.
Great. Derek, you're first. Fire ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Jack. Very cool. Just a couple of cases for perceptual justification that may or may not work, but wanted to get your thoughts on. So one is I'm wondering if the augmented virtual elements could give you some perceptual justification for features on the screen of your augmented reality system, or bits of information about the software underlying the augmented reality system. That seems pretty indirect, but maybe some people don't mind lots of indirectness in their accounts of perceptual justification. And then with regard to the world around you, what if you have a AR system, say, whose primary function is to highlight things of interest, sort of help them pop out of the scene? Would that sort of system maybe give you additional perceptual justification for things than you would otherwise have? And in that case, things in your surrounding environment. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. So I think, let me ask the second one. Let me answer the second one first and then see if I can remember the first one by the time that's done. Yeah, so I think that's a kind of an interesting, maybe a bit borderline case. And I was kind of wondering about that. So if I program the system to highlight the things that I'm interested in. So, I mean, I'll stick with the morel, the mushroom hunting, right? I mean, what it could do is it could just it could just remove the barriers that are partially occluding the things, right? And make it easier for me to see them, or it could kind of draw a line around the outside of them or something like that. I guess I'm inclined to think that that's quasi-perceptual and maybe quasi-inferential. I mean, I think very little of perception is actually very pure anyway. So it wouldn't bother me if this was a case where it was kind of like that. And then very quickly, what was the first part again? Oh,
so that case is about getting perceptual justification for stuff out there. Then you also might wonder whether or not you can get from the virtual elements perceptual justification for things on the screen, or perceptual justification for bits of the reality in the software, or components of the software.
Right. So so I think when what it's doing is labeling things. I mean, obviously, I think it's obvious that I'm getting perceptual justification for the system is telling me this is an Eastern red cedar, right? I think that doesn't give me perceptual justification for this is an Eastern red cedar, right? I think that justification is testimonial, but so I think there's going to be there's going to be that element. But if it's suppose it's, but it's realistic. It's not obvious that it's an augmentation. So it would be illusory, or I mean, it would be non-veridical with respect to. So I mean, it's showing me a cat. Would I have? So I don't believe. So suppose it's showing me a cat, but I think that I'm seeing through it. I'm seeing a real cat. Sorry, Dave, I'm going to say these things are real, and I'm going to say that these things are not real. I know you don't like that. But it's just easier for me to think this way. So I'm going to say that there's a real cat out there. I'm going to believe that there's a real cat. I'm not going to have the belief that I'm seeing a virtual cat. I might have, should I have propositional justification for that? I mean, so I don't have doxastic justification because I don't believe that. I don't know that I would have. I mean, I think it would depend on the case a lot whether I would have propositional justification for believing that. So I mean, suppose I have. Sorry, this is going to be a really convoluted answer. Suppose I have a lot of background information. I think that so if I think that the system is populating the world with cats a lot, then when I seem to see a cat, I would probably have propositional justification. I mean, I could imagine a situation where I have propositional justification for thinking that I'm seeing a virtual cat rather than a real cat.
Jack, David is sort of doing a big fingering signal to me that suggesting he wants to come in here. So would it be all right if we took maybe his question here?
Yep.
Thanks.
Yeah, good. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Can you hear me okay? Good. I'm in a new place. Yeah, I was actually interested in just exactly this point at the end there. So I was tempted to say that I hold the view that you think nobody will hold. That in the case where there's obvious augmentation, there's nonetheless perceptual justification. Of course, I don't think there's perceptual justification for the claim there's a physical object there, but I think in some of these cases there may be perceptual justification for the claim that there's a virtual object there in virtual space. I mean, on a view like mine, we actually, once we're actually used to augmented reality, when it's obvious, we may actually perceive some of these virtual objects as virtual and as being located in virtual space. If that's the case, I don't see why then that shouldn't give rise to perceptual justification for the claim that, yeah, there's a virtual object located there, which I think was at least one version of the view that that Derek was articulating. More generally, I think maybe some of the interest, there's, as well as you focus mostly on epistemological issues about what physical objects may or may not be present, but in general, I think there are lots of interesting epistemological issues here about what virtual objects may or may not be present in these digital spaces.
Right. Yes. I mean, I totally agree. I was entirely focused on physical objects, and so yeah. So I mean, so I think exactly as you do, that if I perceive them as virtual objects, then that's fine, right? And then I mean, yeah, but I mean they are realistically, right? I mean they really do look like virtual objects, right? I mean, so yeah, no, I was presupposing, and I probably shouldn't have, given the crowd I thought might be here, that we're talking about physical objects. So I don't think there's any disagreement between me and you. I think I was just presupposing, like, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to stop us there, and so that we can squeeze in this last question. So Sarah, you have your hand up.
I did, yes, thank you. Yeah, so I am the rogue computer science security guy. And so, you know, with my research focus being on testing and privacy in mixed reality systems, I'm curious about your assumptions in this description of perception and justification in terms of who, I guess the underlying trust in who generates, places, manipulates these virtual objects. Because there have been studies, which is one of the link I dropped in the chat, of when you move into multi-user AR situations where it's not just the system, you know, generating the augmentations, but now other users can generate and place and manipulate these augmentations, that very quickly the other users tend to specifically manipulate these augmentations in order to confuse, distract, startle, otherwise mess with your understanding of the environment, maybe even like block something if in the real world that is important for you to know, and now you can't see it because there's an augmentation in front of you. And I'm just wondering how your framework for understanding perception and justification changes, if at all, when you can have people like other human users with these maybe less than stellar motivations who can manipulate those augmentations, especially as, you know, hardware and software improves and augmentations become increasingly difficult to tell apart from the real world.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. So I think an internalist, most internalists, will say, again, it depends on whether you know, right? I mean, so most internalists are going to say that you're licensed in taking things as they appear and believing that things are as they appear, and so you're licensed for either dogmatic or inferentialist reasons in trusting these people who are objectively not trustworthy until you find out differently. So I'm not an internalist, I'm an externalist, I'm a reliabilist, and so I'm inclined to think that that our being justified and having knowledge in these kinds of environments is really dependent on the kind of social scenarios that we find ourselves in very much the way that that we are with testimony. So you're proposing, I can't remember, I mean, I could read your proposal as supposing only that they're manipulating the perceptible features, but there's a view out there that I like that says that, you know, in the case of testimony, we have testimony, we get justification from testimony only because we happen to live in an environment, and maybe it's, you know, maybe for sort of Davidsonian reasons or whatever, it's not that contingent, but we happen to live in an environment where people are basically cooperative, where testimony is generally reliable. And if we were in an environment where testimony were not generally reliable, we would not be justified, even if we didn't know that we were in such a hostile environment. So if we were in a testimonially hostile environment on this externalist view, we wouldn't necessarily know, we wouldn't be justified in believing testimony. And I'm inclined to think the same thing about the kind of case that you're talking about, right? So if the community of users who get to influence how I perceive things is a bunch of nice people, then great. I maintain my perceptual justification. If not, then no, I lose it.